If you really want to understand the horror of the First World War, you have to look past the famous generals, past the politics. You've got to focus on the cold, hard mechanics of the technology that created the front lines. It was this interlocking system that turned the battlefield into, well, an industrialized meat grinder.
You know, this famous line from Hilaire Belloc was actually about colonial warfare, but it ended up predicting the grim reality of the Western Front. At its heart, the war was a brutal collision of industrial-age machinery with human flesh, and it all really started with one single revolutionary weapon.
So, let's start there, with the Engine of Stalemate. This is the machine that created the deadlock of trench warfare, and basically made 100 years of military strategy obsolete almost overnight.
And here it is, the Maxim gun. Now, before this thing came along, machine guns were clumsy, hand-cranked contraptions, kind of like the old Gatling gun. But Hiram Maxim's invention from 1884, this was totally different. It was fully automatic. It literally used the force of each bullet's recoil to load and fire the next one. This created a continuous, lethal stream of fire. And that one innovation, it changed warfare forever.
600. Just look at that number. That's how many rounds per minute the Maxim gun could spit out. This wasn't just a small step up from old rifles. It was a quantum leap in firepower that no army on Earth was prepared to deal with.
And the impact was just devastating. A single Maxim gun, operated by a small crew of maybe 4 to 6 guys, could put out the same amount of fire as an entire platoon of 60 riflemen. All of a sudden, charging across an open field wasn't heroic anymore. It was just suicide. This weapon, right here, is the reason the trenches were dug in the first place.
So with those open field charges now impossible, the attackers had a brand new problem. And that brings us to the chemistry of annihilation. They needed a new solution, a way to get defenders out of their trenches without actually destroying the fortifications they were trying to capture.
The logic they came up with was as simple as it was absolutely horrifying. See, chemical agents that are denser than air wouldn't just blow over the trenches. They would sink down into them, flowing like water into every single dugout and shell hole. This would either force the defenders out into the open or kill them right where they were hiding.
And 3 main types of gas really came to define this new horror. You had chlorine, which was first used at Ypres in 1915. It was this terrifying visible green cloud that just destroyed your lungs. Then there was phosgene, which was way more insidious. It was colorless and a much more potent killer. And finally, mustard gas. This was an oily liquid that didn't just kill, it contaminated the ground itself, maiming and blinding anyone who even touched it for weeks.
The way phosgene worked was just uniquely cruel. A soldier could breathe it in, feel totally fine, maybe notice a faint smell like moldy hay, and then just keep on fighting. But hours later, maybe a full day after the attack, his own body would turn on him. His lungs would just slowly, agonizingly fill with fluid.
And this quote from the historian Dennis Winter really drives home the clinical, awful reality of it. It wasn't a quick death. It was a slow, agonizing process. You were basically drowning from the inside out, a day or two after the shell that delivered the poison had even landed.
All right, so the machine gun creates the stalemate. Poison gas gives you a way to clear the trenches. But that led to the final logistical problem, which was solved by artillery's deadly tabletop. How in the world do you get your infantry across hundreds of yards of exposed, no man's land?
The answer was the Creeping Barrage. Now, this wasn't just random shelling, not at all. It was a complex, mathematically precise system, a deadly, synchronized timetable of explosions designed to walk just ahead of the advancing troops.
Here's how it works. You'd have thousands of artillery guns, all concentrating their fire on the enemy's front line. Then, on a strict timetable, let's say every 4 minutes, the gunners would increase their range by exactly 100 yards. The infantry, who had already left their own trenches, would then follow this moving wall of explosions across no man's land.
And the key to making it work, and to staying alive, was to hug the barrage. The attacking soldiers had to stay as close as 50 yards to their own exploding shells. It was the only way to get to the enemy trench the very second the shelling stopped, before the defenders could crawl out of their dugouts and get back on their machine guns.
It was this absolutely unforgiving science. If the infantry moved too slow, the barrage would get ahead of them, and they'd be left stranded and exposed in the middle of no man's land. But if they moved too fast, or if even a single shell fell short, they'd be killed by their own side. Everything depended on perfect timing.
So now we can see it. The industrial logic. These pieces of technology, they didn't exist in a vacuum.
They all fit together to form this brutal, interlocking system, a terrible new logic of industrial-scale slaughter right on the battlefield. When you break it down like this, you can see that warfare had stopped being just a battle. It had become a process. The machine gun created the problem. Poison gas was engineered as the solution to that problem, and the creeping barrage, that was just the delivery mechanism for the final component, the infantry themselves. And when you look at it that way, the grim reality of it all becomes crystal clear. The principles of industrial efficiency, inputs, processes, and outputs, they were being applied to the act of killing. Human beings were just another resource, another raw material to be fed into the grinding gears of this terrible new machine of war.
And that forces us to ask one last really chilling question. When warfare gets industrialized, when the battlefield literally becomes a factory floor that's designed for mass destruction, what does that make the soldier? Is he still a warrior? Or is he just a component waiting his turn on the assembly line?